Here we go. I think I'll say the same thing in the show notes. I mean, in the chat. Okay. Hello. Hello. Hi, period. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to my sculpture studio, period. Feel free to ask anything. And be sure to check out my finished work at Okay. Okay, here we go. Just gonna do some more concrete casting today. If you were here yesterday, you'll remember that these are two sculptures that I cast in concrete yesterday. So I'm just gonna pop them out of the mold. And this one is this sculpture. This one is a sun face. We can see it right now. Let's take a look. That's going to be a pretty nice piece when I smooth it and finish it. It's sort of unusual. It's not, it doesn't have all of the sun rays, but just like that, it's kind of cool. This will go over pretty well at my farmer's market stall, I think. This is better than I thought. Yesterday when I cast this, I felt like it was kind of out of control. Too heavy in the middle, too light on the sides, but actually it's strong and light. I'm really satisfied with it. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Okay. So that's good. That turned out well. So like that. I'm gonna grind these later. But for now, I'm really happy with how these are turning out.
halt without any orders, apparently because they had come in contact with some obstacle ahead of them. Go and tell them to form into battalion and get the village, said Kutuzov to a general who came riding along. How is it you do not understand, Your Excellency, my dear sir, that it's impossible to open ranks so along a village street when we are moving against the enemy?
I'm trying to play an audio book, but it's not working out too well. So I just cast these two sculptures in this mold, and they went really well. I thought things were going chaotically yesterday, that it was a little out of control, but actually this is light and strong, and there are no holes in it, so that's good concrete. I may have to cast another one of these today. We'll see. I'm trying to play my audiobook, War and Peace, right now.
I propose
There we
to
go.
form behind the village, Your Eminence, replied the general.
One of the good things about being historically illiterate is that you can read War and Peace and not know how the Battle of Austerlitz is going to turn out. It's very suspenseful.
Kutuzov gave him a saturnine smile. You'd be in a fine condition deploying your front in presence of the enemy. Very fine idea. The enemy are still a long way off, Your Eminence, according to the plan. The plan, cried Kutuzov bitterly. And who told you that? Be good enough to...
I've been thinking of like, can I play music? I can't play music, because it's copyrighted. But if you go to LibriVox.org, there are all kinds of public domain readings of pretty good literature. And if you get they're all amateur readers, but some of them are very good. And if you get a good reader at LibriVox, it's public domain, it's free, and it's a fantastic audiobook. So this is a version of War and Peace. There are several of them at LibriVox that are read by high-level professional quality readers for free.
I obey. Mon cher, whispered Nesvetsky to Prince Andrei. The old man is surly as a dog. An Austrian officer in a white uniform, with a green plume in his hat, galloped up to Kutuzov and asked him in the name of the Emperor whether the fourth column were taking part in the action. Kutuzov, without answering him, turned around, and his glance fell accidentally on Prince Andrei, who was stationed near him. When he noticed Bolkonsky, the vicious and acrimonious expression of his face softened, as though to acknowledge that he was not to blame for what was taking place. And still without answering the Austrian adjutant, he turned to Bolkonsky and said in French, Go and see, my dear, if the 3rd Division has passed the village yet. Command them to halt and await my orders. As soon as Prince Andrei started, he called back, and asked if the skirmishers are posted, and what they are doing. What they are doing, he repeated to himself, still paying no attention to the Austrian. Prince Andrei galloped off to execute this order. Outstripping the battalions, which were all the time pressing forward, he halted the 3rd Division and convinced himself that no skirmishers had been...
As soon as I try to play YouTube and my audiobook at the same time, the audiobook cuts out. Well, still, I got to find out how this Battle of Austerlitz turns out. So let's listen a little bit more.
Thrown out in front of our columns. The general command in front of the foremost regiment was greatly amazed at the order from the commander-in-chief to throw out sharpshooters. The regimental commander was firmly assured in his own mind that other troops were in front of him, and that the enemy could not be less than 10 versts distance. In reality, nothing could be discerned in front of them except waste ground which sloped down and was shrouded in fog. After giving him the commander-in-chief's orders to repair his negligence, Prince Andrei galloped back. Kutuzov was still in the same place, and with his fat body sitting in a dumpy position in the saddle, was yawning heavily with his eyes closed. The troops had not yet moved, but stood with grounded arms. Good, very good, said he to Prince Andrei, and turned to the general, who, holding his watch in his hand, said that it must be time to move, since all the columns had already gone down from the left wing. Time enough, Your Excellency, said Kutuzov. We shall have time enough, he repeated. At this time, behind Kutuzov were heard the sounds of the regiments in the distance, cheering, and these voices quickly ran along the whole extent of the line of the Russian columns under march.
Hi, Stephanie.
It was evident that the one whom they greeted was approaching rapidly. When the soldiers of the regiment at whose head Kutuzov was stationed began to cheer, he rode a little to one side and glanced around with a frown. Along the road from Pratzen came what appeared to be a squadron of gay-colored horsemen. Two of them, at a round gallop, rode side by side ahead of the others. One was in a black uniform with a white plume, on a chestnut horse, groomed in the English style. The other in a white uniform on a coal-black steed. These were the two emperors with their suite. Kutuzov, with the affectation of a thorough soldier, found at his post, shouted, "Smirno, eyes front," to the soldiers halting near him, and saluting, rode toward him. His whole figure and manner had suddenly undergone a change. He had assumed the mien of a subordinate, of a man ready to surrender his own will. With an affectation of deference which evidently was not pleasing to the Emperor Alexander, he came to meet him and saluted him. This impression crossed the young and happy face of the Emperor and disappeared like the mist breeze in the clear sky. After his indisposition, he was a trifle thinner that day than he had been on the fields of Olmütz, where Bolkonsky had for the first time seen him abroad. There was the same enchanting union of majesty and sweetness in his beautiful gray eyes, and on his thin lips the same possibility of varied feelings, and the same predominating expression of beneficent, innocent youth. At the review at Olmütz, he had been more majestic. Here he was happier and more full of energy. His face was a trifle flushed after his gallop of 3 versts, and as he reined in his horse, he drew a long breath and glanced around into the faces of his suite, all young men like himself, and like himself all full of life. Czartoryski and Novosiltsov, and Prince Bolkonsky, and Stroganov, and many others, all richly dressed, jovial young men on handsome, well-groomed, fresh-looking, and slightly sweating horses, chatting and laughing together, formed a group behind the sovereign. The Emperor Franz, a florid young man with a long face, sat bolt upright in his saddle on his handsome black stallion, and slowly glanced around him with an anxious expression. He beckoned to one of his white uniformed aides and asked him some question. Probably he asked at what hour they had come, thought Prince Andrei, gazing at his old acquaintance with a smile which he could not repress at the thought of his audience. The Emperor's suite was composed of young orderlies, Austrian and Russian, selected from the regiments of the Guards and of the Line. Grooms had brought with them handsome reserve horses, in embroidered uniforms for the Emperor. Just as when a fresh breeze from the fields breezed through an open window into a stuffy chamber, so these brilliant young men brought with them to Kutuzov's dispirited staff the sense of youth and energy and confidence in victory. "Why don't you begin, Mikhail Larionovich?" impatiently demanded the Emperor Alexander, turning to Kutuzov, at the same time looking curiously toward the Emperor Franz. "I was waiting, Your Majesty," replied Kutuzov, deferentially bowing low. The Emperor leaned toward him, frowning slightly, hoping to understand what he did here. "I was waiting, Your Majesty," repeated Kutuzov, and Prince Andrei noted that Kutuzov's upper lip curled unnaturally when he repeated the words, "I was waiting." "The columns have not all assembled, Your Majesty." The sovereign heard, but the answer evidently displeased him. He shrugged his drooping shoulders, glanced at Novosiltsov, who was standing near him, and his glance was open with compassion for Kutuzov. "We are not on the Empress's field, Mikhail Larionovich, where the review is not begun until all the regiments are present," said the Emperor, again glancing at the Emperor Franz's eyes, as if to ask him if he would not take part so that he might listen to what he might say. But the Emperor Franz, who was still gazing about, did not heed him. "That's the very reason I do not begin, sire," said Kutuzov in a ringing voice, seeming to anticipate the possibility that the Emperor might not be fit to hear him, and again a peculiar look passed over his face.
I found, I'm just playing an audio of this. It's public domain because it's LibriVox, so it won't get copyright claimed. So I just thought I'd give it a try. What? Only in that red cup, or only in the what's in the cup. That's all there is.
That's the very reason I did not begin the fire, because we are not on parade and not on the Empress's field, he repeated, clearly and distinctly. The voices of all those opposing him expressed a point, and the history of change cannot be words. No matter what he would say, you give the order, Your Majesty, said Kutuzov, raising his head and again sitting at full head to challenge every unexpected
That's why I'm making this now.
Nevertheless, the gesture of the spirit did not refrain from smiling contemptuously. Milorádovich turned his horse sharply round and remained a short distance behind the emperor. The Spherian boys, inspired by the presence of their sovereign, marched with the emperor and their suite with lively, gallant strides, keeping perfect time. "Children," cried Milorádovich in a loud, self-confident and cheering voice, evidently roused by the sounds of the firing, the expectation of the battle, and the sight of the Spherian boys, who had been his comrades in the campaign with Suvorov, and were now briskly marching past the emperors, and roused to such a pitch that he forgot that the sovereign was present. "Children, this is not the first village that you have had to take," he cried. "Do our best," cried the soldiers. The emperor's mare started at the unexpected shout. This mare, which the emperor had ridden before during other reviews in Russia, here on the battlefield of Austerlitz, carried her rider, not noticing the captious thrust of his left heel, pricking up her ears at the sound of the musketry firing, just as she did on the field of Mars, not realizing the significance of those re-echoing volleys, nor of the neighborhood of the Emperor Franz's black stallion, nor of what the man who was on that day sat upon her back said, thought, felt. The sovereign, with a smile, turned to one of his immediate suite, and pointing to the Aspherian lads, made some remark. End of chapter 15. Part 3, Chapter 16, of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. Kutuzov, accompanied by his aides, rode slowly after the carabiners. After riding half a verst, he caught up with the rear end of the column and halted at a single deserted house. It had apparently been a drinking house, near the junction of two roads. Both roads led down into the valley, and both were crowded with troops. The fog began to disperse, and already 2 versts away could be seen, though as yet indistinctly, the ranks of the enemy on the heights opposite. Down in the valley to the left, the firing was growing more violent. Kutuzov halted, discussing some point with the Austrian general. Prince Andrei, sitting on his horse a little distance behind, gazed at them, and then, wishing to obtain the use of a field glass, turned to one of those who had one. "Look, look!" exclaimed this adjutant, turning his glass not at the distant host, but to a hill nearby in front of them. "Look, they are the French." The 2 generals and the adjutants reached after the glass, one taking it from the other. All the faces suddenly changed, and an expression of dismay came into them. They expected to find the French 2 miles away, and there they were, unexpectedly appearing right at hand. "Is that the enemy? It can't be. Yes, look, they." Certainly it is. What does it mean? Exclaimed various voices. Prince Andrei, with his naked eye, could see a dense mass of the French moving up to the right to meet the Assyrian boys, not more than 500 paces from the very spot where Kutuzov was standing. Here it is. The decisive moment is at hand. My chance has come, said Prince Andrei, and starting up his horse, he approached Kutuzov. The Assyrian men ought to be halted, Your Eminence, he cried. But at that very instant all became veiled in smoke. The rattle of musketry sounded near them, and a naively terrified voice, only 2 steps from Prince Andrei, called, Well, brothers, it's all up with us. And this voice seemed to be a command. At this voice all started to run. Confused, but still constantly increasing throngs ran back by the very same place where 5 minutes before the troops had filed so proudly past the emperors. Not only was it hard to arrest these fugitives, but it was even impossible not to be borne back by the mob. Bolkonsky could only struggle not to let them pass him, and he gazed around, finding it quite out of the question to understand what was taking place at the front. Nesvitsky, with angry face, flushed and quite unlike himself, cried to Kutuzov that if he did not instantly go away, he would probably be taken prisoner. Kutuzov still stayed in the same place, and without answering, took out his handkerchief. A stream of blood was trickling from his face.
Oh boy, the Russians are in big trouble in the Battle of Austerlitz. Napoleon has outsmarted them. At any rate, what's going on here right now is I've got a good first interface layer between that'll smoothly cover the inside of the mold. And since it's water-based concrete interfacing with silicone rubber, which is totally waterproof and covered with a light layer of Crisco brushed on, it's very water resistant, and any thin areas will tend to, the water-based concrete will tend to bead up like that and try not to, it doesn't want to stick to the surface, which is good and bad. But I've got a good coverage, nice wet adherence right now. And as soon as this layer, it's structurally very weak, but when it becomes about as hard as leather, I'm going to pour in some more concrete, which will stick to it more thickly and make a good structural layer. And we'll wind up with a good, fairly uniform thickness of anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of an inch. It'll be strong concrete, but light, and it'll be similar to dinnerware ceramic in thickness and strength. That's all in the future, though. Right now, I just have to keep this relatively fluid while letting this solidify to about the hardness and flexibility of stiff leather. Now, let's go back to the Battle of Austerlitz.
Prince Andrei forced his way through to where he was. You are wounded? He asked, scarcely controlling the trembling of his lower jaw. The wound is not here, but yonder, said Kutuzov, pressing his handkerchief to his wounded cheek and pointing to the fugitive. Halt them, he cried, and at the same time, evidently convinced that it was an impossibility to bring him to a halt, he gave spurs to his horse and rode off to the right. New masses of fugitives came pouring along like a torrent, engulfed him, and bore him along with them. These troops were pouring back in such a dense throng that when one was once entangled in the midst of it, there was great difficulty in extricating oneself. Some shouted, He's coming, why don't you let him pass? Others turned around and fired their muskets into the air. Others struck the horse on which Kutuzov rode, but by the exercise of supreme force, Kutuzov, accompanied by his staff, diminished by more than half, struggled through to the left and rode off in the direction of the cannonading heard not far away. Prince Andrei, also forcing his way through the throng of fugitives and endeavoring not to become separated from Kutuzov,
It's really important right now not to mess with this too much until it becomes good and solid. Not solid, but I'm sorry, stiff but still flexible. About like I said, about like shoe leather. Leather hard, they call it in the world of pottery. And here I am messing with it. It's so tempting just to mess with it when it's not ready yet. So we have to let it sit for about 5 minutes. That's a very long time. So let's listen to War and Peace.
Make out through the reek of gunpowder smoke a Russian battery on the side of the hill, still blazing away vigorously, while the French were just marching against it. A little higher up stood the Russian infantry, neither moving forward to the aid of the battery, nor back in the same direction with the fugitives. A general spurred down from this brigade of infantry and approached Kutuzov. Out of Kutuzov's staff, only 4 men were left, and all were pale and silently exchanged glances. "Stop those poltroons!" cried Kutuzov, all out of breath, as the regimental commander came up to him and pointing to the fugitives. But at that very second, as though for punishment for those words, like a bevy of birds, a number of bullets flew buzzing into the heads of the regiment and of Kutuzov's staff. The French were charging the battery, and when they caught sight of Kutuzov, they aimed at him. At this volley, the regimental commander suddenly clapped his hands together. A few soldiers fell, and an ensign standing with the flag dropped it in his hand. The flag reeled and fell, catching on the bayonets of the soldiers near him.
I discovered these
The men began to load and
public
fire
domain
without orders.
audiobooks, so I'm going to try to play that instead of music
Kutuzov, with
and
an
see how it
expression of
goes.
despair, and glanced around. "Bolkonsky," he whispered, his weak old man's voice trembling with emotion. "Bolkonsky," he whispered, pointing to the demoralized battalion and at the enemy. "What does this mean?" But before he had uttered these words, Prince Andrei, conscious of the tears of shame and anger choking him, had already leaped from his horse and rushed toward the standard. "Children, follow me," he cried in his youthful, penetrating voice. Here it is, thought Prince Andrei, as he seized the flagstaff, and he listened with rapture to the whiz of the bullets that were evidently directed straight at him. A number of the soldiers fell. "Hurrah!" cried Prince Andrei, instantly seizing the flag and rushing forward with unfailing confidence that the whole battalion would follow him. In fact, he ran on only a few steps alone. Then one soldier was stirred, and then another, and the whole battalion, with huzzas, dashed forward and overtook him. A non-commissioned officer of the battalion grasped the standard, which from its weight shook in Prince Andrei's hand, but he was instantly shot down. Prince Andrei again grasped the flag, and, dragging it along by the staff, followed after the battalion. In front of him he saw our artillerymen, some fighting, others abandoning the guns and running toward him. He also saw the French infantry, who had seized the artillery horses and were reversing the field pieces. Prince Andrei and the battalion were now only 20 paces distant from the battery. He heard the incessant whizzing of the bullets over his head, and the soldiers constantly groaning and falling at his left and at his right. But he did not look at them. His eyes were fastened only on what was going on in front of him, where the battery was. He now saw distinctly a red-headed artilleryman with his shako knocked in, and on one side, struggling with a French soldier for the possession of the ramrod. Prince Andrei distinguished clearly the distorted and angry faces of these 2 men, who evidently were not aware of what they were doing. What are they up to?
Wow, that's exciting. Okay, this is getting closer to being ready to take another layer of concrete, but it's not quite ready yet. I'd say it's the consistency now of soft Haagen-Dazs. It's past the fluidity of vichyssoise. It's past the consistency of shamrock shake, and now it's sort of like soft ice cream. It's losing its slump. It's still not quite stiff enough to be called leather hard, so I'm going to have to give it another 3 minutes, I think.
Queried Prince Andrei as he looked at them. Why doesn't the sandy artillerist run if he has no weapon? And why doesn't the Frenchman finish him? He wouldn't have time to get any distance, though, before the Frenchman would recollect his musket and put an end to him. In point of fact, another Frenchman, with pointed bayonet, ran up to the combatants, and the fate of the red-haired artillerist, who had no idea what was coming upon him, and had just triumphantly made himself master of the ramrod, must have been sealed. But Prince Andrei did not witness the end of the struggle. It seemed to him as though one of the approaching soldiers struck him in the head with the full weight of a cudgel. It was rather painful, but his chief sensation was that of displeasure because it distracted his attention and prevented him from seeing what he had been looking at. What does this mean? Am I falling? Surely my legs are getting away, he said to himself.
Boy, it's hard to pull myself away from the Battle of Austerlitz, but gotta focus on what we're doing here. I'm trying to keep this fluid and let this get as stiff as shoe leather. And as soon as it's ready, I'll dump this concrete into here and swirl it around. And kind of like in slip casting, the more fluid, watery layer will stick to this slightly drier, stiffer layer of concrete. And it's ready. I can feel it. It's kind of like, now it's more like, it's gone from pea soup or vichyssoise consistency to shamrock shake to soft ice cream, and now it's firm Haagen-Dazs. That's the consistency of this now. So it's ready to pour in this shamrock shake consistency concrete. And this particular step, if you're familiar with slip casting, it's similar. And it's as though this layer of concrete were the ceramic inner surface of a slip casting mold. It will absorb some of the water, and it'll cause this to stick to itself at a fairly uniform thickness as I swirl it around. Does anybody want to go back to War and Peace, the Battle of Austerlitz, while I do this? Just say yes if you do. Yeah, why not? I can't wait to find out what happens next. Prince Andreevich seems to have been shot in the head with a musket ball.
He fell on his back. He opened his eyes, hoping to see how the struggle between the artilleryman and the Frenchman ended, and anxious to know whether or not the red-haired artillerist was killed or not, and the cannon saved or captured. Over him he could see nothing except the sky, the lofty sky, no longer clear, but still immeasurably lofty, and with light gray clouds slowly wandering over it. How still, calm, and solemn. How entirely different from when I was running, said Prince Andrei to himself. It was not so when we were all running and shouting and fighting. How entirely different it is from when the Frenchmen and the artillerymen, with vindictive and frightened faces, were struggling for possession of the ramrod. It wasn't so that the clouds then floated over the infinite depths of sky. How is it that I never before saw this lofty sky? And how glad I am that I have learned to know it at last. Yes, all is empty, all is deception, except these infinite heavens. Nothing, nothing at all beside. And even that is nothing but silence and peace. And thank God. End of chapter 16. Part 3, Chapter 17 of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Hartzell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mary. At 9 o'clock, the right wing, under Bagration, had not as yet to fight. Unwilling to acquiesce in Dolupov's urgency to begin the battle, and anxious to escape the responsibility, Prince Bagration proposed to the latter to send and make inquiries of the commander-in-chief. Bagration knew that as the distance separating the two wings was all...
Okay. So that was our first engagement with Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz. In the third part of the first book of this translation of War and Peace. And I've put a second layer of concrete into this mold, but I think I'm going to need a little more thickness up around here. And I'm going to do that by keeping this fluid and pouring it one more time, only with the top part of this mold. After this second layer gets a little more firm. Hang on, let me see if I can use gravity a little bit here. No, it's not going to work that much. So now we have to sit and wait a few more minutes, and I'm just going to do what I did before. You know what? No, I don't want to do it now. That would be, no, I'm going to wait. I'm going to keep this fluid, let this firm up a little bit, and then pour again, but only pour on this top portion where it's very thin and where I need that thickness. Meanwhile, I'm letting another little bit of concrete over here firm up to about the thickness of clay, and I'm going to use that. You'll see how I use that at the end of this concrete cast. I use it to just make a ridge all around here. So I'm not adding any water or any agitation to this handful of concrete. I'm going to use it like clay to help cement in this hanging wire, and that comes last. Right now, I'm just getting ready to pour this into here after this is firm enough to take it, because I'm gonna tip it up, and I don't want this to flow out of its position. You'll see what I mean. Okay. So while I'm waiting for this concrete to firm up, I'm just going to wash my tools again.
Almost 10 verse. The messenger, if he were not killed, which was very probable, and even if he found the commander-in-chief, which would be extremely difficult, would not have time to return till late in the afternoon. Bagratión glanced over his staff with his great, expressionless, sleepy eyes, and was involuntarily attracted by Rostov's boyish face, full of excitement and hope. He chose him for the messenger. And if I should meet his majesty first, before I found the commander-in-chief, your illustriousness? Asked Rostov, touching his cap to Martin. You can give the message to his majesty, said Dolgorukov, taking the words out of Bagratión's mouth. After he was relieved at the outposts, Rostov had been able to catch a few hours' sleep before the morning, and felt happy, full of daring and resolution, and brimming over with elasticity of motion and confidence in his own good fortune. In such a state of mind, everything seems easy, bright, and possible. All his desires had been fulfilled that morning. A general engagement was to be fought. He was to take part in it. Moreover, he had been made orderly on the staff of one of the bravest generals. Nay, more, he was entrusted with a message to Kutuzov, and might have to deliver it to the sovereign himself. The morning was clear and bright. The horse that he rode was excellent. His heart was full of joy and courage. Having received his instructions, he struck in the spurs and galloped off along the line. At first he passed in front of Bagratión's forces, which had not as yet engaged, and were ranged in motionless ranks. Then he rode into the space occupied by Uvarov's cavalry, and here he began to remark some excitement and indications of readiness for battle. After passing Uvarov's cavalry, he began to distinguish clearly the sounds of cannonading and musketry in front of him. The firing kept growing more violent. The morning air was fresh and clear, and it was no longer firing at irregular intervals, 2 or 3 shots at a time, and then 1 or 2 cannon shot. But along the declivities of the hills in front of Pratzen was heard the thunder of musketry, dominated by such frequent reports from the heavy guns that often a number of them could not be distinguished apart, but mingled in one general rumble. It could be seen how over the mountainside the puffs of smoke from the muskets seemed to run along, chasing each other, and how the great clouds of smoke from the cannon rolled whirling up, spread and mingled in the air. By the glint of bayonets through the smoke, the masses of infantry could be seen moving along, and the narrow ribbons of artillery, with their green caissons. Rostov reined in his horse on a hilltop for a moment, in order to watch what was going on. But in spite of the closeness of his scrutiny, he could not make out or decipher himself from what he saw.
Shift gears. Okay. We're just like with the last layer. I'm waiting for this last concrete that I poured into the mold to firm up, so it can take another layer of fluid concrete up at the top here. So I'm really just waiting for this concrete to become leather hard, and it's taking its time, because I'm going to have to tilt it up like this and agitate it to dump out the excess from this side of the mold, which means this is going to want to flow back into the bottom of the mold, which I don't want. So just got to wait. Yeah, see, it's still slumpy. It's worth waiting though. Hold on a second. I'll show you what the finished, not the finished cast, but what the raw concrete looks like after I take it out of the mold. Just a second. This is the sculpture in cast in concrete before painting and lacquering and polishing. And check out the back. See, this is the back of a fairly chaotic pour I did yesterday, which still turned out okay. It's light and strong. I'll do some sanding and grinding on the back, and it'll turn into a great sculpture. This one too. I did this. You can see how the concrete flowed over the inner surface, and that was yesterday, or day before yesterday, I think. Still waiting on this.
What men were moving in the smoke, or what bodies of troops were hurrying this way and that, back and forth. But why? Who are they? Where are they going? It was impossible to tell. This spectacle did not arouse in him any melancholy or timid feelings. On the contrary, they filled him with a new energy and zeal. Well, then, give it to them again, said he, mentally replying to these sounds. And again he started on a gallop along the lines, making his way farther and farther within the domain of troops already now entering into the action. How this is going to turn out yonder I do not know, but it will be all right, thought Rostov. Having passed by some of the troops of the Austrian army, Rostov noticed that the portion of the line next, they were the guards, were already moving to the attack. So much the better, I can see it close at hand, he said to himself. He was now riding along almost at the very front. A number of horsemen were galloping in his direction. These were our Lieb Uhlans, who, with broken and disorderly ranks, were returning from the charge. Rostov passed them and could not help noticing that one of them was covered with blood, but he galloped on. That's of no consequence to me, he said to himself. He had ridden only a few hundred paces further when he perceived at his left, coming down upon him, an immense body of cavalry extending the whole length of the field and likely to cross his path. They were on coal-black horses and dressed in brilliant white uniforms. Rostov spurred his horse at full speed so as to get out of the way of these cavalrymen, and he would easily have done so had they kept on at the same pace all the time, but they rode faster and faster, and some of the horses were almost upon him. Rostov distinguished more and more clearly the trampling of their feet and the jingling of their arms, and could see more and more distinctly their horses, their figures, and their faces. These were our Cavalier Guards, on their way to charge the French cavalry, who were deploying to meet them. The Cavalier Guards came galloping along, still keeping their horses under restraint. Rostov could already see their faces and hear the word of command spoken by an officer. March! March! Who was urging on his blooded charger. Rostov, afraid of being crushed or carried away into the charge against the French, spurred along the front with all the speed that he could get out of his horse, and still it seemed as though he were going to fail of it. The last rider in the line, a pock-marked man of giant frame, frowned angrily when he saw Rostov in front of him, knowing that they must infallibly come into collision. This guardsman would surely have overthrown Rostov, for Rostov himself could not help seeing how small and slight he and Bedouin were in comparison with these tremendous men and horses, if he had not had the presence of mind to shake his riding whip into the eyes of the guardsman's horse. The charger, black as coal, heavy and high, shied, cropping back his ears, but the pock-marked rider plunged his huge spurs into his side with all his might, and the charger, arching his tail and stretching out his neck, rushed onwards faster than ever. Rostov was hardly out of the way of the guardsmen when he heard their huzzas, and glancing around saw that their front ranks were already mingling with strange horsemen with red epaulets, apparently the French. Farther away it was impossible to see anything, because immediately after this, on the other side, the cannon began to belch forth smoke, and everything was shrouded. At the moment that the guardsmen dashed past him and were lost to view in the smoke, Rostov was undecided in his own mind whether he should gallop after them or go where his duty called him. This was that brilliant charge of the Cavalier Guards which the French themselves so much admired. It was terrible for Rostov when he heard afterward that out of all that throng of handsome young giants, out of all those brilliant, rich young men, officers and junkers mounted on splendid chargers who galloped past him, only 18 were left alive after the charge. Why should I envy then? My turn will come, and perhaps I shall see the sovereign very soon now, thought Rostov, as he galloped on. When he came up to the infantry of the guards, his attention was called to the fact that shot and shell were flying over them and all around them, not so much because he heard the sounds of the missiles, as because he saw dismay on the faces of the soldiers, and an unnatural martial solemnity on the faces of the officers. As he was riding behind one of the infantry regiments of the guard, he heard a voice calling him by name. Rostov. What is it? He replied, not seeing that it was Boris. What do you think of this? We were put in the front line. Our regiment has been in a charge, said Boris, smiling with a happy face, such as young men wear when they have been for the first time under fire. Rostov drew up. Have you indeed? He said. And how was it? Repulsed, said Boris eagerly, and becoming talkative. You can imagine. And Boris began to relate how the guards, as they stood in their places and seeing troops in front of them, mistook them for Austrians, and then suddenly by the shots that came flying over them from these same troops, recognized that they were in the front line and unexpectedly engaged in the conflict. Rostov, not stopping to hear Boris to the end of the story, started his horse. Where are you bound? To His Majesty, with a message. There he is, said Boris, who supposed that Rostov wanted His Highness instead of His Majesty, and therefore pointed him to the Grand Duke, who was standing not 100 paces away. Dressed in a helmet and a Cavalier Guard collet or jacket, with elevated shoulders and frowning face, he was shouting something to a pale Austrian officer in a white uniform. No, that's the Grand Duke, but my errand is to the Commander-in-Chief, or to the Emperor, said Rostov, and was just getting his horse under way. Count! Count! Cried Berg, who, no less excited than Boris had been, came running out from the other side. Count, I have been wounded in my right arm, said he, pointing to his wrist, which was bloody and wrapped up in a handkerchief, and I stayed at the front. Count, I had to hold my sword in my left hand. In our family, all the von Bergs have been knighted. Berg went on to say something more, but Rostov, not stopping to listen to him, was already far away. Passing by the guards and across the vacant space, Rostov, in order not to get into the front again, as he had been when he was caught by the charge of the Cavalier Guards, rode along the line of the reserves, making a considerable detour of the place where the most violent cannonade and musketry firing was heard. Suddenly he heard loud volleys of musketry before him, and behind our troops, in a place where he would never have suspected the presence of the enemy. What can that mean? Wondered Rostov. Can the enemy have outflanked us? It cannot be, he said to himself, and a horror of fear for himself and for the success of the battle suddenly came over him. Whatever it is, however, he thought, now there's no avoiding it. I must find the Commander-in-Chief here, and if all is lost, then it is my place to perish with the rest. The gloomy presentiment which had come over him was more and more made certainty the farther he rode into the fields behind the village of Pratzen, which were occupied by throngs of demoralized troops. What does this mean? What can this mean? At whom are they firing? Who is firing? He inquired, as he overtook Russian and Austrian soldiers running in confused throngs across his path. The devil only knows. He has beaten us all. All is lost, answered the throngs of the fugitives in Russian, in German, and in Bohemian, and they could tell no better than he himself what was going on there. Hang the Germans, cried they. The devil take us, the traitors. Zum Henker diese Russen. To the devil with these Russians, stammered some German. A number of wounded were wandering down the road. Curses, cries, groans, mingled in one general uproar. The firing ceased. As Rostov afterwards heard, Russian and Austrian soldiers had fired at each other. Ousmane, my God, what does this mean? Thought Rostov. And here, where any minute the Emperor might see them. But no, these were apparently only a few cowards. This is only transient. This is nothing. It cannot be, he said to himself. I must get by them as soon as possible. The idea of a defeat, and of a total defeat, could not enter Rostov's head. Although he could see the
Almost.
French cannon
Not
and
quite
troops
yet
in
ready.
Kreutzer, on the very place where he had been commanded to find the commander-in-chief, he could not and would not believe this. End of chapter 17. Part 3, Chapter 18 of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. Rostov had been told that he should find Kutuzov and the Emperor somewhere in the vicinity of the village of Pretzen. But they were not to be found there, nor was a single Nachalnik in sight, but everywhere throngs of fleeing troops of all nationalities. He spurred on his horse, which was already growing fagged, so as to pass by these fugitives as quickly as possible. But the farther he went, the more demoralized he found the forces. Along the high roads where he was riding, carriages and equipages of all sorts were crowded together. Russian and Austrian soldiers of all the different branches of the service, wounded and not wounded. All this mass hummed and confusedly swarmed under the dispiriting sounds of the shells fired from French batteries posted on the heights overlooking Kritzen. Where's the Emperor? Where's Kutuzov? Asked Rostov of all whom he could bring to a stop, but not one could vouchsafe him any answer. At last, seizing a soldier by the collar, he obliged him to reply. "Eh, brother, they've all been yonder this long time, all cut sticks," said the soldier, laughing for some reason, and breaking away. Releasing the soldier, who was evidently drunk, Rostov managed to stop the denshchik, or the groom of some person of consequence, and began to ply him with questions. The denshchik told Rostov that the Emperor had been driven by an hour before at full speed, in a carriage along this same road, and that the Emperor had been wounded. "It cannot be," said Rostov. "It must have been someone else." "I myself saw him," said the denshchik, with a self-satisfied laugh. "I also know the sovereign by sight. I should like to know how many times I have seen him in Petersburg." He leaned back in the carriage and was pale, very pale. Heavens, what a rate those 4 black horses thundered by us here. I should think I might know the Tsar's horses. And Ilya Ivanovich. I guess Ilya, the coachman, wouldn't be very likely to drive by with anyone less than the Tsar. Bruce.
Okay, I think we know how the Battle of Austerlitz is turning out for the Russians. Not too good. Back to sculpture. This is losing its slump. This was my second layer of concrete in this mold, and it's a little heavy on the bottom, light on the top. So I'm going to do one more pour of relatively fluid concrete into this mold. It's going to stick to the existing layer as soon as it's firm enough to, like I said, it's losing its slump. And this time I'm going to pour it out from the top, and hopefully this will not slump down, but the fluid stuff the excess will pour out, and we'll have a little bit of a thicker layer on the top of this mold here. And then I'll be ready to put in the wire and start using my clay hard concrete here to make a nice ridge around the edge and cement in the wire. So this needs to be a little more fluid in order to pull this off, but not too fluid. Okay, let's just do it. I'm gonna need this. agitate it enough to make this that I just poured in there flow without making this slump down. So I just got to be a little gingerly with it. It's working. Yeah. Now dump this out. Let's just dump it out. Come on. That's good. Yeah, that's going to work. Okay, now. Be gentle with it. We can put in the wire. It's probably too fluid to hold the wire for right now, but at least I'll get an idea. Yeah, see? So we'll have to give it a minute. If I put some of this in here now. Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's going to hold it. Okay. So we're going to have to wait another 7 minutes or so for this to solidify, which will give us a chance to mourn a little bit more of the aftermath of the Battle of Austerlitz. So let's find out what's happening with Prince Andrei Rostov and everybody else. Okay.
Rostov gave his horse the spur and started to ride farther. A wounded officer passing by turned to him. "Who was it you wanted?" asked the officer. "The commander-in-chief. He was killed by a cannonball. Hit him in the chest, right at the head of our regiment." "Not killed, only wounded," said another officer. "Who? Kutuzov?" asked Rostov. "No, not Kutuzov. But what do you call him?" "Ah, well, it's all the same. Not many are left alive. If you go down yonder to that village, you'll find all the commanders gathered," said the officer, pointing to the village of Kostiradek, and he passed on. Rostov walked his horse, not knowing now where to go or whom to seek. The sovereign wounded, the battle lost. It was impossible to believe that, even now. Rostov rode away in the direction indicated by the officer. In the distance could be seen towers and a church. What was the need of him to hurry? What had he now to say to the sovereign or to Kutuzov, even if they were alive and not wounded? "That road. Take that road, your nobility, else they'll shoot you down yonder," cried a soldier to him. "They'll shoot you." "Oh, what are you talking about?" cried another. "That's the nearest way to where he's going." Rostov considered a moment, and then rode in exactly the direction where they said that he would be killed. "Now it's all the same to me. If the sovereign is wounded, why should I try to save my life?" he asked himself. He rode out on the open space where there had been the heaviest slaughter of men escaping from Pratzen. The French had not yet occupied this place, and the Russians, that is, those who were alive or only slightly wounded, had long before abandoned it. On the ground, like shocks of corn on a fertile field, lay 10 men, 15 men, killed or wounded, on every rood of the place. The wounded had crawled together, 2 or 3 at a time, and their cries and groans could be heard most gruesomely, though it seemed to Rostov that they were often simulated. He put his horse at a trot, so as not to see all these suffering men, and a great horror overcame him. He was not afraid for his own life, but lest he should lose the manliness which he felt was essential to him. He knew that he could not endure the spectacle of those unfortunate wretches. The French had ceased to fire on this field strewn with dead and wounded, because there was no longer any sign of life on it. But when they caught sight of the adjutant riding across, they trained one of their cannon on it and sent a few balls after him. The sensation caused by these terrific whistling sounds, and the spectacle of the dead around him, aroused in Rostov's mind an impression of horror and self-commiseration. He recalled his mother's last letter. How would she feel, he asked himself, if she should see me now, here in this field, with these cannon pointed at me? At the village of Kostiradek, the Russian troops were retiring from the field of battle in good order, though the regiments were mixed together. This was out of range of the French cannonballs, and the sounds of the firing seemed more distant. Here all clearly saw and openly confessed that the battle was lost. No one to whom Rostov applied for information could tell him where the Emperor was, or where Kutuzov was. Some declared that the report about the sovereign being wounded was correct. Others denied it and explained this false, though widespread rumor by the fact that the Oberhofmarschall, Count Tolstoy, who had gone out in company of others of the suite to see the battle, had dashed away pale and frightened from the field of battle in the emperor's carriage. One officer told Rostov that in the rear of the village, over toward the left, he had seen some officials of high rank, and Rostov started in that direction, not indeed with the expectation of finding anyone, but merely for the sake of clearing his conscience. After riding 3 versts and passing beyond the last of the Russian troops, Rostov reached an orchard protected by a ditch and saw 2 riders standing near the ditch. One with a white plume in his hat had a familiar look. The other rider, whom he did not know, was mounted on a handsome chestnut charger. This charger somehow seemed familiar to Rostov, and rode up to the ditch, put spurs to his horse, and giving him his head, easily leaped the ditch into the orchard. The earth merely crumbled away a little from the embankment under the horse's hind hoofs. Turning his horse short, he leaped back over the ditch again, and addressed himself respectfully to the rider with the white plume, apparently urging him to do the same thing. The rider, whose figure Rostov seemed to recognize, and had therefore involuntarily attracted his attention, shook his head and made a gesture of refusal with his hand, and Rostov immediately by this gesture knew that it was his idolized, lamented sovereign. But it cannot be that he is left alone in this bare field, thought Rostov. Just then Alexander turned his head so that he had a good view of those beloved features so sharply graven in his memory. The sovereign was pale, his cheeks sunken, and his eyes cavernous, but there was all the more charm, all the more sweetness in his features. Rostov was delighted to be convinced that the rumor of the sovereign's wound was false. He was happy to have seen him. He knew that he might, nay, that he ought, go straight up to him and deliver the message that had been entrusted to him by Dolgorukov. But just as a young man in love trembles and loses his presence of mind, not daring to say what he has been dreaming about night after night, and timidly looks around, in search of help or the possibility of postponing it, when the wished-for moment has at last arrived, and he stands alone with her. So also with Rostov, now that he had attained what he had yearned for more than all else in the world. He did not know how to approach his sovereign, and devised 1,000 excuses for finding it untimely, improper, and impossible. But I might seem to be taking advantage of his being alone and dejected. An unknown face at this moment of sorrow might seem unpleasant and troublesome. Besides, what could I say to him now, when one glance from him makes my heart swell within me and seem to leap into my mouth? Not one of those innumerable speeches which he had so carefully prepared in case he should meet the emperor now recurred to his mind. Those speeches were for the most part indicated under different conditions. They were to be spoken at the moment of victory and triumph. Above all, on his deathbed, when he sank under the wounds that he had received, his sovereign would come to see him and thank him for his heroic conduct. Thus he would show him his love sealed by his death. Besides, what now could I ask the emperor in regard to his commands to the left wing, when now already it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the battle is lost? No, really I ought not to trouble him. I ought not to break in upon his reflections. It would be better to die 1,000 times than to receive an angry look or an angry word from him. Such was Rostov's decision, and melancholy, and with despair in his heart he rode away, constantly glancing back at the emperor, still remaining in the same undecided attitude. While Rostov was making these reflections and sadly rode away from his sovereign, Captain von Toll galloped up to the same place, and seeing the emperor, went straight up to him, offered him his services, and helped him to cross the ditch on foot. The emperor, wishing to rest and feeling ill, sat down under an apple tree, and Toll stood near him. Rostov looked from afar, and saw with jealousy and regret how von Toll talked long and eagerly to the sovereign, and how the sovereign, apparently weeping, covered his eyes with one hand, and with the other pressed von Toll's. And I might have done that in his place, thought Rostov, and with difficulty restraining the tears of sympathy for his sovereign, he rode away in utter despair, not knowing now where he should go or for what reason. His despair was all the more bitter because he felt that his own weakness was the cause of his misfortune. He might, not only might, but he ought to have ridden up to the emperor. and this was his only chance of exhibiting to the sovereign his devotion, and he did not take advantage of it. Why did I do so? He asked himself, and he turned his horse about and galloped back to the same place where the emperor had been sitting, but there was no one any longer on the other side of the ditch. A train of baggage wagons and carriages was winding along. From one of the wagoners, Rostov learned that Kutuzov's staff were not very far away, at the village where the wagons were bound. Rostov followed them. The foremost in the train, Kutuzov's groom, leading a horse with his trappings. The wagons followed behind the groom, and behind the wagon walked an old man, a household serf with bandy legs, wearing a cap and half shuba. Tit! Ah, Tit! Cried the groom. What is it? Asked the old man heedlessly. Tit! Tit! Grind the wheat. Durak! Said the old man, angrily spitting. Some time passed in silence as they moved onward, and then the same joking rhyme was repeated. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the battle was lost at every point. More than 100 cannon had already fallen into the hands of the French. Przemysl and his battalion had laid down their arms. The other columns, having lost more than half their efficient, were retreating in disorderly, demoralized state. The relics of Langeron and Doktorov's forces, all in confusion, were crowded together around the ponds, on the dikes and banks of the village of August. By 6 o'clock, the only cannonading that was any longer heard was directed at the dike of August by some of the French, who had established a large battery on the slopes of the Pratzer, and were trying to cut down our men as they retreated. At the rear, Doktorov and some others, having collected their battalions, made a stand against the French, who were pursuing our troops. It had begun to be entirely dark. On the narrow dike of August, for so many years the little old miller had peacefully sat with his hook and line, while his grandson, whose shirt sleeves rolled up, played in the water can with a palpitating silver fish. On that dike, over which the Moravians, in shaggy caps and blue blouses, had driven their 2-horse teams loaded down with spring wheat, and returned dusted with flour and with whitened teams. Along this same dike, this narrow dike, among vans and field pieces, under the feet of horses and between the wheels, crowded a throng of men, their faces distorted with fear of death, pushing each other, expiring, trampling on the dying and dead, and crushing each other, only to be killed themselves a few steps farther on. Every 10 seconds a cannonball, compressing the air, flew by, or a shell came bursting amid this dense throng, dealing death and spattering with blood those who stood nearby. Dolokhov, wounded in the arm, on foot with 10 men of his company, he was now an officer again, and his regimental commander, on horseback, constituted the sole survivors of the whole regiment. Carried along in the throng, they were crowded together near the entrance of the dike, and pressed on all sides, were obliged to halt, because a horse attached to a field piece had fallen, and the throng were trying to drag it along. One cannonball struck someone behind them, another struck just in front, and spattered Dolokhov with blood. The crowd moved on in desperation, squeezing together, and then halted again. If only we could make those 100 paces, and safety is sure. If we stay here 2 minutes longer, our destruction is certain, said each one to himself. Dolokhov, standing in the midst of the throng, forced his way through to the edge of the dike, knocking down 2 soldiers, and sprang out on the glare ice that covered the pond. Turn out this way, he cried, sliding along on the ice, which bent under his weight. Turn out, he cried to them. It will hold, it will hold. And it was evident that it would immediately give way, if not under his weight alone, certainly under that of the field piece or the throng of men. They looked at him, and crowded along the shore, not venturing to step upon the ice. The commander of the regiment, sitting on horseback at the entrance, was just raising his hand and opening his mouth to speak to Dolokhov, when suddenly a cannonball flew so close over the men that they all ducked their heads. There was a dull thud as though something soft were struck, and the general fell in a pool of blood. No one looked at the general and saw the quicken beneath. Come on the ice. Cross the ice. Come on. Move on. Don't you hear? Come, was heard suddenly from innumerable voices after the cannonball had struck the general, though the men knew not what or why they were crying. One of the last field pieces that was just entering the dike ventured on the ice. A throng of soldiers hastened down from the ground upon the frozen pond. One of the rearmost soldiers broke through, one leg slanted down into the water. He tried to save himself, and sand covered his back. The men who stood nearest fought back. The driver of the field piece drew in his horses, but still behind them were heard the shouts. Take to the ice! What are you stopping for? Take to the ice! Take to the ice! And cries of horror were heard among the throng. The soldiers surrounding the gun gesticulated over their horses and beat them to make them turn and go on. The horses struck out from the shore. The ice, which might have held the foot soldiers, gave way in one immense sheet, and 40 men who were on it threw themselves some forward and some back, trampling on each other. All the time the cannonballs kept regularly whistling by and falling on the ice, into the water, and, more frequently than all, into the mass of men that covered the dike, the ponds, and the banks. End of chapter 18.
All right, looks like things didn't go very well in the Battle of Austerlitz, but my sculpture cast seemed to be pretty successful. I think I'll cut the video here for now, and I'll be back as soon as I work on another one. Thanks for joining if you watched.